taking a street engine and making it a high-performance engine, there's definitely going to be some considerations that have to be taken. And I'm very excited to have Lake Speed Jr. at a ring grinder. He's Mr. Total Seal. My goodness, we get to see you in your genuine element.
Exactly, sir. So it was cool to see Jimmy Barton talk about those little nuances between a street motor and what happens when you take it and make it a race motor. And obviously cooling is a consideration. They talked about at length and having the right tools to do the job. Okay, here's another tool to do the job. So ring end gaps. And this is a question that I know Keith and Kevin and Bobby and everybody gets out of the tech line of Total Seal all the time.
Every day.
What should my ring end gaps be? So we're going to go down that road a little bit, and let's talk about conceptually about ring end gaps for a little bit, and then we'll actually go through a little demo. We're going to show you, we're actually going to set the end gaps on this gas-ported piston ring. So it's a little fancy high-tech piece.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, so we'll go through that. We got all of our tools here. Got our feeler gauge. We know it's not a ring, it's a ring compressor. We don't have the block back here, so we're going to do a little Hollywood magic, and we're just going to use the ring compressor as our gauge, so we can go take some end gap off and put it back in and measure it and go through that. But the whole reason is, why do we have ring end gap?
Why do we have ring end gap, Lee?
So the one reason is you have to have ring end gap to be able to install it on the piston. That would be kind of a neat thing you need to be able to do.
Yes.
Now, once you get it installed on the piston, the idea is that ring end gap needs to be able to compensate for the growth in the ring with temperature. We had Pat Musi on earlier, and what was he saying? If you could take the cylinder heads off right at the end of the run.
Glowing red.
Right. So what happens to metal when it gets hot?
It expands.
Exactly.
Even I know this stuff, folks.
So the more cylinder pressure you run, the more power you're making, the more heat that's going into the ring. Therefore, you need a larger end gap. So, of course, we don't have to do all the mental gymnastics. Our buddy Randy Neal gave us that term the other day. At Total Seal, we actually have a complete listing of recommended end gaps based on the application. For example, like Pat's application, you're running nitrous. Big power, big heat, bigger end gap. So that top ring needs a bigger end gap because it's going to see the bulk of the heat. So the idea of that is you need that bigger gap so that it doesn't butt. Because what happens is if your rings butt, bad things happen. Because now it's trying to expand, it can cause increased cylinder wear, it can do lots of damage to your engine, so you don't want that. So, and nitrous is an interesting topic of conversation in regards to end gap because, you know, a normally aspirated engine is only going to be able to develop so much heat with just an air-fuel mixture. But when you add nitrous, now you've got this accelerant that's going to drive that temperature up. But you're not always running the nitrous with full hit going in the bottle. So what happens is you have to set that end gap for your worst case scenario, the most amount of nitrous you're running, which means that every moment you're running that engine without that, you have a bigger end gap. And you're like, well, why does that matter? Well, back to Mr. Hydrocarbon guy, this is called blow-by. Blow-by, it allows the combustion gases that would normally be driving the piston to make power to escape past the piston. That's a lack of efficiency. So ideally, you want your end gaps, when the engine's running, to be almost zero, is where you want to be. That's kind of hard to figure, which is why Joe Moriarty years ago invented the Total Seal piston ring, which back then was the only thing we had was a gapless ring. And the idea of the gapless ring is it overlaps. It was two overlapping rings that closed that gap. It would allow you to have that big end gap for that max cylinder pressure, max temperature, but then at normal driving conditions, at lower temperatures, you still didn't have that increased blow-by. So it could compensate. Now, that's the idea of a gapless ring, is as you have talked to Keith on the show, Hidden Horsepower, you know, there's applications for that. Now, this particular ring I'm holding is basically a NASCAR type ring that's a gas-ported ring. And
which it's teeny tiny.
It's small.
There's not a lot going on there.
But it's a seal. I mean, you gotta think about it. We were talking about pistons the other day with Jimmy Barton, and he said, no, the wrist pin is the backbone of the piston. It's the structural component. Piston rings are not a structural component of the piston. It's a seal. You wouldn't think about putting an iron gasket between your head and your block because it can't move around. This needs to be able to flex, right? Gaskets are soft. They're designed to conform. Rings are designed to conform, which is one reason why Total Seal invented the Total Conform ring, where it's got these little radial notches in the back that allow the ring to conform. Back to the gas-ported ring, it can conform to the distortion of the piston because that piston isn't completely strong out there on the edges. Like Jimmy said, you move the wrist pin in, but now the outside edges can move. So the gas ports in the ring are doing a couple of things. Not only allowing the gas pressure to get behind the ring to increase ring seal, it's also allowing the ring to move and seal against the bottom of the groove, which is also a big area of ring sealing. But back to the beginning topic, ring end gap. We know we want to have the correct gap for that top ring and the second ring. And there's some theory about second ring end gap. And let's address that real quick. Some guys say the old school way of doing it was you set the same end gap for the top ring and the bottom ring, knowing the top ring is going to be hotter, so it's going to grow more, so there's a second gap that will actually in operation be wider. That would allow that any gases trapped between the top ring and the second ring to escape. Now, what's happening in the modern low-tension rings when you're getting to a, say, 3 millimeter or a 2 millimeter style oil ring, what we're seeing is they actually like having a little bit wider second end gap when you have lower ring tension to use that blow-by to help evacuate the oil from the oil ring. Because that oil ring, when it gets small, has less tension than, say, a 3/16 ring. So there's some people that have done that. We won't get into all the details right now. Maybe another time, another video. We get some maybe a guy like Brad Peters. If you're watching, Brad, I want you on here. We can talk about this, buddy.
Yeah, this isn't the last one of these.
No. So anyway, so let's talk about how you set the gap. So once you've got the idea of what gap you want, the power ring filer is going to get the job done for you. And hey, my boss, Matt Hartford, the guys at Total Seal, they made this super easy. Even somebody like me can do it. So what you do is you put the ring on the ring filer. So what we're going to do here is we're going to hold the ring in position with this. That's going to be the clamp. But you want to set the right radius because you don't want to cut it crooked. What you're going to do is we're going to put the ring down here like this. We're going to move the ring and set it against the square it against the grinding wheel. Now this little device out here is going to be able to adjust out and give us the radius. Now we're only doing one ring. The nice thing about this is once the radius is set, you can run through 8 rings, boom, boom, or 4 rings, or however many, back to back to back. So we're going to set this right here. So now it's clamped down. We know it's locked in. This is locked in. We're all good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set our dial indicator to 0. So now we know we're beginning at 0. And in this case, we pre-measured it. There was 22 thousandths end gap. We want to take it out. Say we want to take it out to, say, 30 thousandths end gap, all right? So what we're going to do is now we're going to turn on the ring filer. We set it to 0. Now we're just going to begin to move and grind it in. Now there's a couple ways you can do this. Now I'll back up here just for a second. Some guys like using this as the chop method, right? And you can do that with a bigger ring. But because this is a tiny itty bitty ring, you don't want to bend that ring because it's pretty thin. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start it down here and we're going to roll it back this way. And I'm just holding that table down, dialing it in. And I was at 22, so I'm going to take 8 thousandths off the dial indicator. And when I put it back in the ring compressor, simulating our bore, that should give us right at 30 thousandths. And I'm just going real slow, letting it creep up on it, because again, this is a thin ring, and you don't want to hurt your ring. You don't want to bend it. It needs to be square and level and flat. So there we go, right at 8 thousandths. Turn that off, bring it up. Now the deburring wheel over here, we can use that to deburr it, because we're just moving along for time here. I'm going to skip that step. But now we've opened that gap up. We're going to set it here in our ring compressor. Again, I know I don't have a squaring tool. I know how wrong I'm doing this, so just know that.
We're on TV.
Yeah. So I made some marks to set it in here, closest I'm going to get it. It was 22. Oh, it's a whole lot more than that now. So let's get out our 30 thousandths feeler gauge. Roll her over to it. Now I can drop it right in. Boom. Done. It's that simple. So with the right tools to do the job, you can rip through this, and it's way better than that hand grinder.
Oh my goodness, and I still see those every now and again in use, guys cranking them out.
Oh, yeah.
But if you have an opportunity like this, and it's a great machine, and this is available at Total Seal, obviously we got to deburr that before we leave the set today.
Oh, we're not.
Yeah.
We would never ever put what we just did in an engine. Just know that. But this is for demonstration purposes only.
Well, I think it is great, and it's just another example. We've learned a lot over the course of the week about different tools that have made jobs more efficient and easier, and here's one. If you're spending a lot of time doing this, you can get them all the same. You get uniformity, you have efficiency, and isn't that what it's all about? You save some time.
Exactly. And the whole idea is we want to have, you know, efficiency throughout the whole engine and efficiency in the time it takes to build the engine. So having the time, a tool that saves you time, now you're not just worried about your top end gap and your second end gap. You can actually deal on your oil ring end gap, because that's part of, for a vacuum engine, a dry sump engine that's pulling vacuum, or even a wet sump motor that's got a vacuum pump, you can actually gain some power and get better blow by dialing around your end gaps on the oil rails on the oil ring. So a little, you know, hidden horsepower there, but you got to look into it. So this makes that job easier, because if anyone's ever tried to grind an oil ring that's hard steel, you know you don't want to do it with that grinder. This thing makes the job a lot easier.
Oh, excellent work, and I appreciate it. And obviously, this is something you can find more information about at the Total Seal website. They sell them, as you can imagine. And of course, the end gap, the recommended end cap, is available on the web as well, right?
Yes, all the recommendations are right there on the website.
Excellent. Now, we have gone to the point where we have done some things that we think are going to make our engine more powerful, and we're going to go to the dyno, which is what everybody loves. Like, the idea of dyno testing is just the coolest. I remember being around my first dyno test. It was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And some of the videos, I know there have been people who have been with us all week long who've been super stoked to see a little dyno testing going on. Well, buckle up, because we are about to test. You don't just test, there's a right way to test, and we're about to find out what that is.
Yes, sir. So we started off with the engine block. We've gone through the short block, the balancing, camshaft, valve train, EFI systems. We've done the whole thing. Like you said, now it's time to put that engine on the dyno. But as Dyno Don Mac Askill, the head guy of the dyno cell at Shaver Specialties Racing Engines, is going to tell us, he's going to show us how to do it, and then how to go about doing that testing procedure the correct way, so that, as Warren said, you don't lie to yourself.
There you go. Check it out.
This is technically take 3, but no one knows that. So anyway, hello and welcome. I'm Lake Speed Jr., and this is
Dyno Don Mac Askill from Shaver Racing Engines. Hi, guys.
Welcome to the Engine Performance Expo. So today we're going to be doing two things. The first thing is we're going to give a little talk here about testing, and specifically the mindset of testing. And then later we're going to not just talk about it, we're going to use this dyno, this engine back here, and we're going to show you some of the things we're going to talk about in this video right now. And then at the end of this hour, both of us are going to be available to answer your questions live via Zoom. Now, today it is November 17th.
Something like that, yeah.
That's just November. We're here at Shaver Specialties. So we're recording this now, but then we'll be available here in a little bit to do the question and answers live during the Engine Performance Expo, which thank you for registering. So before we jump into testing and that mindset for testing, you may not know who we are. So Don, why don't you share with the guys and the girls who are watching your background?
Well, you know, I started in this business when I was 14 years old. I'm almost 60 now, and I can actually start to feel a little bit. But at 14 years old, I went to work for an automotive machine shop that was run by my uncle's best friend. And at that particular time, I was obviously still going to school, and my whole goal was eventually to become an engineer. I wanted to become a mechanical engineer. Well, one thing led to another, and that didn't quite work out so well for me. I did end up spending a little bit of time at college, but what happened was that I kind of stayed in this field, and in my early 20s, I actually bought the shop that I started working at, and I did that for a few years. And again, at that particular point, I met some guys that were involved in auto racing. Frank White, Bill Shoemaker, some of these guys that started racing at Ascot, and that's kind of where I got my intro into auto racing is Ascot Raceway Park. That's where I first started. I went from there to Saugus Speedway, and being involved as a crew chief and an engine builder. Actually won a championship up at Saugus. Got Mechanic of the Year.
Right.
So I realized that I kind of had a little bit of a talent thing going on here, and I really kind of wanted to keep it going. So I actually did. I kept moving my way up the ladder here. Ended up in Concord, North Carolina, and this is I didn't know Lake at the time, but he was actually lived there at that particular time, and of course this was probably in the mid '80s. And at that point, I kind of had to make a decision, because when you're that involved in auto racing, you spend so much time at it, you kind of got to make a decision. Do you want to have a family? Do you want to race? Now, luckily, some of the folks don't have to do that. I really kind of did, because when you live on the West Coast and you're racing on the East Coast, having a family didn't work out for me. So I made a very tough decision and decided to come home to my family. Best decision I ever made. And in doing so, the second best decision, well, one of the best decisions I've ever made, was coming to work here for Ron Shaver. As most of you know, Ron Shaver is a legend. Is a living legend, and to be able to spend the last 24 years working for Ron Shaver has just been a blessing for me. Currently, I'm the shop foreman, but one of my main jobs is running the engine dyno, which I've been doing for the 24 years that I've been here. And that's kind of a small little history of how I started at a very young age and just kept going throughout this racing business that we have here with engines and working with drivers to the point where we can actually start to have fun here in the shop and just do some experimentation, and that's kind of where we're at right now.
Right, so thanks, Don. And so if you don't know, I'm Lake Speed Jr. My dad, Lake Speed Sr., was a NASCAR driver from 1980 through 1998. The majority of Dad's career, he was an owner driver. So we had our own shop. We built our own engines, built our own chassis. So that's the environment I grew up in. In fact, from the time I was born, my dad was still racing go-karts. In 1978, Dad won the World Go-Karting Championship. So I grew up at a racetrack, traveling around, just like Don said. I still live in Concord, North Carolina. But in 2004, I went to work for Joe Gibbs Racing. And it was in 2008 when we were trying to develop some non-race oils, some hot rod oils for the street applications. That's where I hooked up with Don and Ron and Dan and Keith and all the guys here at Shaver Specialties Racing Engines to begin doing some testing on non-race applications. Because you see, back then we had all these cup engines to do engine oil testing with, but those are really different engines.
It's a different type of oil needed for that kind of application.
Right. And of course, we had AVL dynos and things like that to do that kind of testing with, which was great. But the problem is, when you've got a DLC-coated part, that's different than a cast iron part. So if you're going to develop an oil for a DLC part, well then, that's great. But you can't expect it to work the same on a cast iron part. So what we did was, okay, cup engine's a cup engine, runs in a cup engine dyno cell where everything's made and fit to do. What we did is we built this little engine back here that is our cast iron cam, chilled iron lifter. We can do the basic stuff with this engine and use that as a guidepost for non-coated, more normal street performance type applications. We developed this engine to be able to do those kind of product development. Now here's the key. So we built this engine to do that testing, to develop products for that kind of market. The key is we had to have the proper mindset, the proper framework to do that testing to be able to yield the results we were looking for. Don, why don't you just expand on that a little bit and let them know what we mean by that?
Well, the whole prospect of trying to develop first oils and now we're working piston on some rings. We're working on piston rings right now. It's not just for the daily driver average application. The things that we've learned so far actually benefit almost every type of engine development, whether it be for your stock car, whether it be for your grocery getter, or whether it be for a 950 horsepower sprint car engine. The things that we've learned here with the tools that we've been given. Now, first of all, big huge thanks to the people at Superflow dynos. Without this dyno that we have here, the Black Widow dyno, it's some of the things that we've learned over the last 12 years seriously would not have been possible. So thanks to those guys at Superflow. But the mindset that Lake is talking about is the procedures that we have to go through on doing every single test. Lake and I have developed most of the tests ourselves. We just kind of came up with them because we're both kind of scientifically. We have a scientific background. We kind of think the same that way. So we've developed our own test, and we have to be certain that every time we do a test, every time we make that dyno pull, that the conditions are the same every time. Very, very important, and that's where the mindset comes in. You know, when you do a test, you receive data. The computer prints out data. One of the biggest issues that we try not to do is to try not to look at that data until we're done collecting it all, because it's very easy to manipulate data, and that's one of the things that we purposefully make sure that we're not doing.
Exactly. So really what it comes down to is this mindset is really 4 steps. And that's the key thing that we took from Joe Gibbs Racing, from working with Lubrizol back in the very beginning of oil testing, is this mindset is really 4 steps, 4 procedure points, if you will, to get it right. So you have confidence in that what that data is telling you in the end is real and repeatable. Because in the end of the day, what do we do testing for? We're racers at heart. We want to go faster, and we want to be able to go longer. You need durable power. That's the goal. You want to put it in one phrase, durable power is what we're after. It's no good. I've always hated that saying that the best race engine in the whole world is the one that blows up right when you get past the finish line. I'm like, no way, no! It means if it's about to blow up, it means it was not running its best.
Right.
You know, it's wearing itself out.
What if you had that last yellow flag?
Right. So no. You want durable power. I want to be able to power through the finish line and that engine come apart and still be pristine. That's the goal. You want durable power. That's what we're after. And this mindset, these steps, I'm going to go through them right now and give you these 4 steps, and then we can kind of talk about each of them a little bit more individually. But the number one thing is you have to have a baseline. If you can't have a repeatable baseline, then you're going to have a hard time making incremental gains. I used to work for Melling Racing before I was at Gibbs, and Chad Canals, arguably one of the best crew chiefs in NASCAR history, was our crew chief. And one thing I learned from Chad is you don't win the Daytona 500 pole by building a car and finding a half a second at a time. Nope. What you do is you get tenths, half a tenth, and all those do add up to having a car that's half a second faster than everybody else.
Right.
So it's the small gains added up to get the big gain. So yeah, this engine, we can make a 20, 30 horsepower gain on that motor, but you don't do it in one shot. It's a bunch of small things, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7s added together to get that. So you have to have a baseline that's consistent that you can build from to make those small gains, and then you have to have a dyno and a environment that's capable of being repeatable enough to see those small gains.
And that's part of the second step, which is controlling all the variables. That is one of the most important things that we have here in the dyno cell, is controlling those variables. As all of you guys know, when you're running an engine, you know, an engine will start at room temperature, and by the time you get done running, it's going to be hot. Temperature changes. Temperature changes affect everything. They change. They affect the oil. They affect the fuel. They affect the water. So what we do here on the dyno to make sure that our variables don't change is we can control that stuff. Now, in doing so, for example, we did a test yesterday with we've been doing some rig tests. We're going to get into that in just a second.
Yeah.
But we can let the temperature go up or down on its own based on the components that we were using, as we found out yesterday.
Yep.
And we'll explain that in a minute. Or we can go back and check to make sure, did that temperature change come because of the added friction, or did it become, or was it the temperature that caused that change? Well, so we went back and made the temperatures the same. That's all about controlling the variables, and that is one of the four most important things that we do here in the dyno cell.
And the whole key is when you're talking about controlling those variables, when you're planning your testing, because that's actually step number 3, is building your plan. So you have to, 1, have that baseline. You got to control the variables. Step number 3 is build your plan. And when you build your plan, you don't change more than one variable at a time.
Very important.
That's the goal, is that you want to change one component, one variable. And the variable could be something like oil level, which we'll show
Get
in
into
the
that
next
in a minute.
video.
We
right?
have a
We'll
big
get
thing
there.
about that right there.
Oil level.
We kind of learned that one the hard way.
That was one of the lessons learned the hard way. Most of the lessons we learned, we did learn the hard way, right?
But lesson learned, though.
Yeah, exactly. So you change one variable at a time, and then you want to have that discipline. And this is the hard part, and Don knows it about me. You have to have the discipline to stay on that plan. Do not let what the data that's flowing at you, because this Superflow dyno generates a ton of data. And it's very easy to let all that data overwhelm you and, oh, squirrel, run away, let's go try that. No. You have to stick to your plan, work your plan, and then only after the fact do you let the data talk to you and you interpret that data.
It's so important. It's so important. And again, Lake and I've been doing this for a long time, and he's one of the guys that loves the data part of this whole thing. You know, and he's very, very good at looking at the data. The problem with looking at so much data is when you get really good at it, you can learn to manipulate it, and that is one of the most important things that we have tried not to do. We do not manipulate the data at all, and not only that, but we don't. This is the hardest thing for him to do, is we don't analyze the data until after we've collected it all. Right. Because if you try to analyze the data as you're going, then it's just a little bit easier to manipulate.
Yeah, you can drift.
You can drift.
That's the problem. You don't want to drift. You want to stay.
And both of us do that. We'll catch each other sometimes. Okay, stop. Just let's see what the data leads us to, not vice versa.
And the thing, just like yesterday, Don was talking about, we went from our baseline 0.7 millimeter, 2 millimeter ring package, which I know that sounds crazy thin and light, but the last 3 years plus on this engine, that's our baseline ring package, is a 0.7, 0.72. I know that sounds super thin, but the reality is that yielded the performance, the consistency from that engine that we needed to do long-term durability tests that are race simulation tests so that the temperature doesn't go up. Thinner rings, less friction, not just more horsepower, less temperature. Again, we learned a lesson learned yesterday.
Exactly.
Putting in 3/16 rings in the engine, not only did it lose power, more importantly, it generated more heat. I don't think we could have run one of our 2-hour race simulation tests
with that ring package.
No. I mean, just too hot.
Yeah, just one thing that I'd like to throw in here while we're talking about this, for some of the guys that don't know, the rings. Back in the day when we first started, a 16th inch top ring, the thickness top ring, that was a racing ring. That was what we all used because that's what was available at the time. Now, if somebody would have told me 25 or 30 years ago that a 30 thousandths ring would seal a 950 horsepower motor, I would have told them they were crazy. But as it turns out, not only does it work, it works better. And there's reasons for that, which we're going to get into in a little bit.
Yeah, so anyway, these are the kind of things that we see that, when I was talking about not letting the data change you, what happens is if you follow the procedure, you establish your baseline, then you can see those variables from there. You only change one variable at a time, and you work your plan, you stay disciplined on your plan, and only after the fact do you analyze the data. What happens is then you will get ideas for new tests. So that's the
So while you're analyzing the data, shut the motor off, will you?
Oh yeah, exactly. So anyway, it's like Don was saying, is if you ever seen that book, if you have kids or grandkids, the Give a Mouse a Cookie book. Okay, that's me and Don on the dyno. Is that you learn something new every time. Yeah. We have a plan for this week. We're working the plan for this week. But already, we've learned something we didn't expect. So now there will be another test. We're going to do it later today.
To back up what we learned. Yeah.
Yes. So it's by having the mindset, following the procedures, doesn't limit you, actually.
No.
what it does is it makes it where you have consistency and confidence in what you've learned, and then you can add more tests with only controlling the one variable, and you just build that body of knowledge. I mean, literally, this engine's 12 years old. It's got thousands of pulls. We looked at it yesterday. Just in the last 2 years, there's over 1,100 dyno pulls on that engine in just 2 years. So over the lifetime of that engine, I don't even want to know.
Oh my God, it's been thousands and thousands. How a motor could stay together that long is sometimes amazes me.
Speaking of variables, that's the key thing. And so we want to be able to control those variables. One of the things you have to do is to kind of look at only all the data that this thing can collect and all having the sensors and how we can control the engine. We also want to look at environmental considerations, not just air temperature, barometer, things like that. Something simple. We mentioned about oil level earlier, I think, that how you fill the engine. For example, this engine, again, ran yesterday with the 3/16 rings. Today, we're going to run it with still 3/16 rings. But we took out the standard baseline rings and we put in some Total Seal gas-ported top high-performance rings, which are going to be a little bit different ring set to see how does that ring set perform in terms of power, temperature, all that compared to the baseline. But when we do
compared
that,
to the stock ring,
exactly. Yeah. When we do that, though, we got to make sure the oil level is the same.
Very important.
You may say, well, that's easy. You got a dipstick. You just check it. Well, yeah, but here's the thing. We use BR40. That's our baseline oil we use to break in everything here. Use it from way back in the day when I worked at Driven and I formulated it, and we developed that formula here. The current formulation was based on that engine.
And it's not just this motor, folks. Every sprint car engine that I break in on the dyno has BR40 in it. Because why? Because that's how much trust I have in this oil.
It works.
It just works.
We know that it will do what it does. It's back to it's eliminating a variable. Yeah. We know what that oil is going to do. We know its history, so it's not a variable in your program. So if you're changing what oil you use between tests, you're adding a variable. So you got to be consistent on the type of oil you're using.
And what happens when you put it in too fast, Lake?
See, that's the trick. So this engine being room temperature and the drum of BR40 over there being room temperature means that oil is going to move in pretty slow. So what happens is if I just keep adding oil and checking the dipstick, well, that oil's got to go from up here all the way down to the bottom of the oil pan. It takes time.
It takes a little time for it to run all the way down there past all the components.
So, now, and the components, they're in the way, right?
The components are in the way. So the thing is that if let's just say that you mess up a little bit and you put a little bit too much oil in it. Well, most people say, well, that's not going to hurt anything. Folks, we're gonna show you today what happens when you actually put too much oil in the motor.
And it's really easy, especially if you're putting in, say, a 20W50 on a cool day into a cool engine. If you don't wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes from the last quart you put in to verify the level on the dipstick, it's very likely you will overfill the engine if you just go 1, 2, 3, or to save time, we've got a 2-quart one? We can pour 2 quarts at a time in. So if you overfill it by 2 quarts, we won't even want to try 2 quarts today. But the whole thing is, these are the kind of small details you have to look at. You know, we've got a fan down here. We've got water valve back there. These are all the things we have to use to control the temperature of the engine
during all the tests.
So that if we were looking just at horsepower, the only way to look at just horsepower, you have to have the same water temperature, oil temperature, same oil level. You have to have all those variables identical, no variance, to be able to know what the horsepower difference is.
That combined with the collection instrument that we have here, the Superflow Dyno, if you do all those things correctly, if you control those variables like we've just been talking about, then you can, with this particular machine especially, you can see the 1, 2, 3 horsepower difference, and that's how you learn over a period of years. And like Lake said earlier, that those 1s, 2s, and 3s horsepower gains over a period of time will net you a net gain of sometimes 20, which is more than we've gained with this engine since we've started, just by changing components, component sizes, and development of oils.
Yep. So it's again back to the mindset of watching for those variables, knowing that little details like oil level, the type of oil you run, the type of fuel we run. So
what time of year you buy the fuel.
Yeah, so for example, with this engine, what we do, our testing, I go to the same gas station. There's an Exxon station up there on the corner of De Anza and 190th. That's where I go. I go over there and I buy the fuel from that gas station. So it's the same fuel, bring it back. But like Don mentioned, it's not necessarily the same fuel
Nope.
in March versus May.
Not in Southern California, unfortunately.
No, when they go from winter blend to summer blend here,
Because of our smog laws, they changed the fuel. So the fuel's not quite as good in the summertime. And I remember one time when Lake came, I think it was the end of March or early April, whatever, and we're looking at these numbers and we're going, why are we down 4 horsepower? That just doesn't make sense. And it just, both of us hit us like a light bulb.
Yep.
They just changed the fuel from the winter blend, which is a little heavier, and to a summer blend, which has a little bit more methanol, and it makes a little bit less power. But it's better for the environment.
so that's the thing is with this dyno, in this engine, this baseline, with our test procedure, we can see that difference in the power curve just on the fuel alone. That we can run the same everything, same cam, same oil, same ring, same timing, same everything, and then see the difference in the power curve just based on the winter blend versus the summer blend of the fuel. So that's that. These are just examples of the level of detail you have to have in your head in order to really get good, accurate testing. And as we mentioned earlier, this isn't something that's just proprietary to here. This is these rules that how these what we're doing here are also done in the VA Supercar teams, the Formula One teams, the NASCAR teams, the Pro Stock teams. This is how the top shops around the world do their testing, because
The same principles apply.
yes, exactly. Whether you're using a water brake dyno, an eddy current dyno, if you're doing a single cylinder engine or doing a V16 gasoline engine or a 410 sprint car engine, the rules, the mindset still apply, even if the parts and pieces are different. This is a framework you can use in order to make that progress.
So how do you start? So now that you've got that kind of information, how do you start? Well, then you need to build a plan. And this is one of the things that Lake and I have been working on for the last 12 years or so. Because we're both kind of scientifically minded, so to speak, we have come up with certain plans, certain procedures that we use every single time, and we don't vary from those procedures because any slight variation makes the test invalid. So we make sure that plan, step number 3, the plan is there before we ever fire the engine up.
And that is critical. I mean, something as simple as what the preload setting is.
Exactly.
The oil level, we talked about what fuel you're using, the timing, what we do in terms of the break-in process. Like one of the things that really stood out yesterday is that we know with this engine that we do a 3,000 RPM, 30-minute break-in at X amount of throttle, 15% load. We know what it's going to do. And when you see the temperatures go way up with that same thing, you know something changed. What is it that changed?
Why is the engine building more temperature with this ring than it did the last ring? All the settings are the same, Lake.
Yeah.
What happened?
Right.
Well,
So
it's that's how we find out throughout the years and through the last bit of testing we've done just in the last day or so about what the difference in this particular ring pack does versus the thinner rings.
So you would never know that and have the confidence in that if you didn't have data. We've got notebook after notebook after notebook from all the tests. We know, we document what timing did we run, what oil did we run, what were the end gaps.
This is the data king right here.
If you collect all that data, then you can go back. My phone is full of pictures of dyno screens and this and that, of everything we documented over all the years, because when you establish that baseline, and in this case, when you have thousands of dyno pulls, now our database is huge, so that we can know what those changes are, what they make. And that's the key, is that it sounds hard and like, oh, you're fussy and sticklers about details. Well, the reality is, what you're doing is you're building a living, breathing database that's only going to help you build better engines. Your engines are going to be better for your customers. They're going to go faster. They're going to run longer by having actionable data, actionable knowledge that you can use, because it was based on truth and reality and science, because you're just taking these amazing tools. I keep pointing back to it. It is an amazing tool, and we have to say thank you, Ron Shaver, for letting the two of us get back here and goof off and play and have fun doing this. Thanks to Matt and Joe and all the guys at Joe Gibbs Racing and Total Seal, and everybody that's allowed me over the years to come. My wife, she definitely thank my wife for all the time. Of
course.
Let me come spend it out here.
Hi, Lee.
She thinks I have a girlfriend out here. Her name is Superflow.
Yeah.
Our Oscar is the name of the engine. That's what it is. Me and Don spend here. We test. We have fun. Is it that it's not just a rugged discipline.
The data, folks, the real-time data that we get when we're running an engine is mind-boggling. There's no way to comprehend the screens that I'm looking at when I'm running an engine. Now, I've learned over the years to look at certain facets of the screen while I'm running a 950 horsepower motor, just in case something goes wrong, and I've gotten really good at shutting them off when they start to blow up. Yep. Luckily, that doesn't happen to us very much. But the data that the computer, that is sent to the computer, that is stored, when you get done with the run, you go, oh, okay, thanks. Okay, so I didn't get all that, but now we can go back, and this is where Lake has a fun time, is he can go back and look at all that data. Both of us can go back and look at all that data and then compare what we were expecting versus what we got to see if we've either gained or lost. Now, one of the most important things that I keep telling Lake is, because he loves the data so much, sometimes he tries to look at the data too soon, and I have to stop him. And because when you do that, sometimes you will get into a bad habit of trying to manipulate data, which is very easy, by the way. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that. So I have to calm him down every once in a while and just say, wait a minute, Lake, let's make all the pulls first and then go back and look at the data.
Exactly, Don. That's why they have Don, right? To keep me on track, because I can be a bit of a squirrel. Sometimes I can. To be honest, my wife knows that. But anyway, so the point is, I think you understand that testing is really about a mindset. You need to have the baseline. You need to control the variables and build controlling those variables into your plan.
Exactly.
Have your plan. Have the discipline to work the plan. Then analyze the data.
Only when you're done with the motor. You got to shut the motor off first.
Yes. Did that yesterday. I'm not perfect. So you follow the procedure, you go through it, analyze the data after the end, and then that's going to lead to, like we said before, the Give a Master Cookie book. We're going to have more tests to come, because you keep learning things you didn't even know you didn't know. Yeah. And that's what makes all this stuff,
that's the mindset,
so much fun.
That's the mindset we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah, so if you have that mindset and you go to it and you apply it, you're going to be great. One little other tip to trick before we get out of here is also look at the auxiliary, the environmental things. Not just what the data channels are telling you, but also things like the sound. Use your ears, use your nose. Capture all the data. The data isn't always just X's and O's, zeros and ones.
I have a good story about actually feeling the engine. As a dyno guy for all my life, I actually can feel the motor, and that can be a whole other segment right there. But that's also part of it, what Lake was saying. It's not just watching your computer screens or playing with the knobs on the computer. It's feeling the engine and trying to figure out what the engine wants. So Lake and I were just talking about some of the tools of the trade, so to speak, that we use when we're checking out engines. A guy like me who has tested thousands and thousands of motors, I've got a couple of tools that I use, especially on a motor that we just put back together, that allows me to listen to what's actually happening inside a motor. Now, when you've got all these moving parts that are happening inside the engine, the crankshaft, the camshaft, the timing chain, there's the rock arms, the valve train, there's certain noises that I expect to hear on a motor that's okay, that is braking incorrectly, and there's certain noises that I do not expect to hear, which means that there could be an issue. So with a simple tool like this that is actually made for listening to motors, this will allow me to listen to the inside of an engine after we fire it up without the external noises of the exhaust, and just make sure that everything inside is doing the job that it's supposed to do.
Oh yeah, and again, with this engine over the years, I know what it sounds like. I can hear when it's wrong, and I've grabbed Ron before, like, hey, come here. Something's not right. I can't tell you what's right because I'm not you, but I know from the sound it's not right. So utilize things like, look at the oil filter. That's one of these we're going to do in the next videos. We're going to look at oil analysis. Really great, powerful tool. Looking at the oil filter. One of the telltales, how we know that engine yesterday made more temperature than it did before.
This will surprise you guys.
It's because the oil filter that came off of it, the label was crinkled. That's never happened before on this engine with the 0.7 millimeter rings. But with the 16th rings,
we develop more friction.
More friction.
That means more heat.
More heat, exactly. And it showed up in the wrinkling of the label on the oil filter. So hopefully...
Not just on the temperature gauge, but actually on the oil filter label itself.
Yep. So if we had temperature strips, that'd even better. Something
Exactly.
new, right?
Right,
See,
exactly.
this is what we do.
Something else to do.
Exactly. More data. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed watching this. So at this moment, we're going to throw it back to Joe. Even though we're recording this in November, we're going to throw it back to Joe Castello, and he's going to basically set up the question and answer time so that me and Don can answer your questions. Then we'll get back to the dyno later. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed it.
See you guys.
What a day, what a day, what a day. My brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.